Hey everyone, we're going to talk about a turning point in the Vietnam War today called the Tet Offensive. But before we get there, we have to remember that President LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, he is now in charge of the war. He has a blank check for the war where he can do whatever he wants pretty much because of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that law that was passed that gave him the power to do basically whatever he wanted. Remember, he's the president because JFK was assassinated, and now what does President Johnson choose to do with the war with his new power under the Gulf of Tonkin resolution? Well, he's going to choose to escalate the war. So, war has been going on for several years. Johnson has escalated it at this point, and then this event known as the Tet Offensive is going to go on. So, what Johnson had been telling the people, what his government, his administration have been telling the American people, is that victory is just around the corner, that the U.S. was going to win the Vietnam War, that the North Vietnamese would surrender, that things are going very, very well. But then this event, the Tet Offensive, happened, and it's going to prove that Johnson has been lying to the American people about what has been happening in the war. So, if we look at the map, North Vietnam up here, remember this is the communist side of the country led by Ho Chi Minh, is going to launch a huge attack on over 100 South Vietnamese and American occupied cities, towns, villages in South Vietnam. You see all these blue star looking things? These are all the different areas that the North Vietnamese are going to attack pretty much simultaneously during this event called the Tet Offensive. Now, you see that they are going to sneak through Laos and Cambodia to launch these attacks without having to go over the DMZ. And that's how they're going to be able to do these simultaneously. So, this is what people often call a military victory for the United States, but a political defeat. So the Tet Offensive was a huge attack, but the North Vietnamese didn't win the offensives. They killed lots of Americans, there were lots of battles, lots of fighting, but let's think about what Johnson said. He said victory was just around the corner, that the North Vietnamese will surrender soon, that it's almost over. Except if it was almost over, would the North Vietnamese be able to launch all these attacks all over South Vietnam? No. So it proves that the war is nowhere near over. And it really becomes a turning point in the war because this is when the public is going to stop believing what President Johnson and what the U.S. government is telling them about the war. That the war is not in fact over. That the U.S. is not winning all these battles in an overwhelming way. That North Vietnam isn't weak, but in fact still pretty strong and still willing to take on the United States and South Vietnam and not willing to surrender or give up. So the Tet Offensive proves that the president is lying and that this war is going to go on for a very, very long time. And part of that belief that the American government is lying and Johnson is lying and this war is going to go on forever is because of the new role of the media. Remember, in the 1950s, this new invention called the television set comes out, and lots of Americans love to watch the 3 channels that are on TV. So people would actually see reporters who go over with a camera crew to Vietnam and record what's happening and have live news reports and tell American death tolls every day of Americans dying that day on TV during dinner time when Americans are watching TV. And it's a constant reminder to the people that this war is bad and it's going very badly. And the footage that they saw from the Tet Offensive is going to horrify them and say, this doesn't seem like it's just a bunch of villagers in the north that the U.S. is trying to stop from spreading communism. It feels like this is actually a huge offensive. And remember, this isn't just the U.S. Army fighting there, where they're all volunteer soldiers. The draft happened, the military draft, where people were randomly selected to go fight in this war had been going on. So people's own husbands, their children, are going to be going to this war, and seeing the battle, seeing the death tolls scares Americans, and they overwhelmingly will start to oppose this war over the next several years. So the role of the media helps turn the American people against the war in Vietnam, which hurts the war effort that Johnson and these other American presidents before him were working on. I'm just going to show you a clip, for the most part, of some of the media coverage that was going on there.
New war. The Viet Cong simultaneously attacked just about every major city and town in South Vietnam. In one day, they increased the scope of the war dramatically. Howard Tuckner was there.
The war came to Saigon early in the morning of January 31st. The first target was the symbol of the American presence in Vietnam, the United States Embassy. About 20 Viet Cong had invaded the embassy compound and were now battling American Marines and military police. The Viet Cong had penetrated to the center of what was supposed to be the most secure city in Vietnam.
On the fifth day of the battle for Hue, the Marines moved out from the fortified Army compound that withstood the original attack and advanced into the empty, abandoned buildings of what was Hue University. Hue, the ancient imperial city. It is to Vietnamese what Old Boston is to Americans, where many of its country's leaders are born or educated, where many returned to celebrate Tet a week ago when the fighting began, where many remain hidden in the unknown interior of...
What's the hardest part of it? Not knowing where they are, that's the worst one. Riding around and running the sewers and the gutters anywhere. Be anywhere. Just hope you can stay alive from day to day. I just want to go back home and go to school. That's about it.
You lost any friends?
Quite a few. We lost one the other day. The whole thing stinks, really.
For days now, they've been fighting.
So we're going to stop there. So we see literally Americans fighting and talking about the experience they're having during the Tet Offensive and seeing all these battles going on. And it really just shows the American people at home, through the role of the media, that this war isn't over. That if victory was just around the corner, this wouldn't be happening. So the American people are going to turn against the war because of the Tet Offensive. And that leads us directly to... Excuse me. That leads us directly to what we call the anti-war movement. So, as the media is reporting what's going on in the war and misleading them about, and showing them that the government is misleading them about what's going on in the war, Americans simply start to say the United States needs to leave this war, needs to abandon Vietnam. Screw domino theory, they're going to say, where communism will spread throughout Asia. That's Asia. We're worried about the Americans who are losing their lives now in Vietnam. So the anti-war movement is going to be a larger movement that we're talking about several aspects of today. And it's going to be about protests for the removal of American troops and against the Vietnam War. You're going to see Americans during this anti-war movement burn those draft cards, those cards that are going to have their draft number on it, and require them to go to the war if their number is picked, if they're drafted for war. Students are going to be probably the biggest part of the Vietnam War anti-war movement, because so many students did not want to be drafted. They were the age of draftees, people that were to be drafted. And although initially college students weren't drafted, pretty quickly they're going to start drafting people that are in college, in American universities, to go to Vietnam, when all these kids want to do is go to school and learn, and are overwhelmingly against the war. So there's a lot of student activism in the anti-war movement. And you're going to see a lot of expression of new types of art and music coming out during this time. There's a big anti-war movement musical festival called Woodstock that's going to bring attention to the anti-war movement and make it more mainstream. As you see here, it's described as 3 days of peace and music in 1969 while the war is going on. So let's go a little more into the anti-war movement now. So Americans are going to start saying that there's a credibility gap, that there's a gap between what President Johnson and the government are saying about the war and what the media is showing them on TV, what's actually happening. So there's a gap between what is credible. And people start to believe that Johnson is no longer credible, that what the government is saying isn't true, isn't believable. So they're not credible, Johnson's not credible, they're not trustworthy. And there's a gap between what Americans saw on TV and the lies government is telling them about the war. So this starts to really hurt Johnson's approval numbers. People start to disapprove of President Johnson, and that leads us to a decision that President Johnson's going to make, which caught many people off guard. So Johnson's going to say before the election, before his re-election campaign really gets going, that he's not going to run for re-election. That he starts to realize that, hey, the anti-war movement is growing, that people are against the Vietnam War, and he stops, as you see in this headline right here, he halts North Vietnam raids. He starts toning down, de-escalating the war a little bit, and he makes an address on television to the American people and on radio that he is not running for re-election, and he starts to, like we said, de-escalate that war in Vietnam, which is going to allow for the next president to win. And that man becomes known as Richard Nixon, and he is a Republican, unlike Johnson, who is a Democrat. So Nixon, this is now Nixon's war. So everything we talk about now is going to relate to Nixon. So we see that this war is a very long war. It really starts with Truman way back with containment, the containment era, when he's talking about stopping communism from spreading, and then Eisenhower becomes the first president to really send advisors along with Kennedy, and then Johnson escalates the war before de-escalating, and now it's Nixon's turn. So a very, very long war. So Nixon is going to take control of the war, and he's going to tell people that he's going to tell the American people that all those people that are out there protesting in the Woodstock musical festivals and out there on college campuses, all those people that are being really loud about their disapproval for the war and wanting the war to end, he's going to say that those people are very loud about their support, but there's not actually that many of them. He's going to say most people actually support the war. They're just quiet about it. And he's going to call these people the silent majority. He's going to say most people are actually supporting the war. They're just not yelling it from the rooftop saying, yeah, Vietnam, let's go get them. No, they're just quiet about it. So he's going to say most people actually support him. And his approval numbers kind of support that. But things are going to continue to complicate Nixon's presidency with some things that are going on college campuses, like the college campus of Kent State University, where there's a shooting and some students die. So this is all in response to something that Nixon did. So while the anti-war movement prompted Johnson to de-escalate the war, de-intensify the war, push it back a little bit, Nixon's actually going to escalate a little more. He's going to expand the war into an area of Indochina on that peninsula called Cambodia, a country next to Vietnam. So he's going to realize that communism's spreading there, and he's going to start to bomb Cambodia. As you see here, see North Vietnam and Cambodia down here next to South Vietnam. So he sees that communism spreading there and starts bombing this country as well. Well, this is going to prompt the anti-war movement to really start to escalate their attacks on Nixon and call for the war to end. So student activists, college kids are going to start protesting all around the United States. But something happens at Kent State. So National Guard troops were called into Kent State University after the protesters got a little too crazy. They burned a whole building down. There were so many people. People were abusing public property. So National Guard troops were called in. Except, and you see them here, except things didn't go well. The National Guard troops ended up firing into a crowd, and there was a lot of confusion, but 4 students ended up getting killed. And this is an iconic photo from this Vietnam era, from this Kent State University shooting, with a girl crying for help after this student was shot and killed. And this moment in American history actually spurs this anti-war movement to grow even more, showing that Americans are turning against each other because of this war, and this war has to end so kids like the one you see before you here on this slide don't get killed because of them wanting the war to end. So the Kent State University shooting hurts Nixon a bit, but it also shows that this war needs to end. It helps grow the anti-war movement. And that brings us to another more legal subject, another legal subject that's going to take place here. And this is going to be a Supreme Court case called Tinker versus Des Moines. So we see here that Mary Beth Tinker and her brother John Tinker are holding these armbands. They're going to go around their arms that have peace signs on them. So they're obviously, in a way, part of this anti-war movement, wanting peace, not war. So Mary Beth and John Tinker are going to wear these black peace armbands, like we said, and they want to wear it to school. Except, to make things a little quicker, they're actually going to be suspended for wearing these armbands, as the school district thought they were distracting. So they are suspended for quite a while for wearing these armbands. But the Tinker parents, Mary Beth and John Tinker's parents, are going to sue the school district, saying, you violated my children's First Amendment rights, their freedom of speech, their freedom of expression. And it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to agree with the Tinker parents and say that the school district of Des Moines, Iowa, the Des Moines, Iowa school district violated their First Amendment rights, their freedom of expression rights. And today, we still have this precedent that student speech cannot be censored unless it disrupts classwork or involves disorder. And there's no evidence that wearing a peace armband actually disrupts classwork. So this case, Tinker versus Des Moines, is really about student rights and rights to protest, as long as it's not disruptive in the class environment. And just a few more. There's also going to be a new amendment that is coming out called the 26th Amendment. So a lot of those college students that were being sent to war that were not 21 yet, the age that it was to vote, were very upset that they could be drafted at age 18 but did not have the right to vote because they weren't 21. So people were saying, if I'm old enough to be drafted for war, if I'm mature enough to go fight and potentially die for my country, shouldn't I be old enough to vote? And you know what? Americans agreed with them, and Congress passed the 26th Amendment and ratified it, and the states ratified it, accepted it. And now, if you're 18 today, if you're not quite 21, you have the right to vote because of student activists, because of college students and 18-year-olds who believed that if you are old enough to go fight and potentially die for your country, that you should be old enough to vote. And we have the 26th Amendment because of that today. Now, let's get to our final moment in the anti-war movement and with Nixon's presidency, with something called the Pentagon Papers. So the Pentagon Papers were a study of how the war was going and everything that's been going on in the war, basically from President Truman through Eisenhower, through Kennedy, through Johnson. And they were a classified or secret document that was supposed to be, you weren't supposed to be able to see it. It was supposed to be classified, saved, secret, just for the military, for the Pentagon. Except it was leaked to the press. So somebody leaked it, and the press, the media got a hold of it, and it really showed that pretty much all the presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, had all misled the public, had all really lied to the public about the war, that they lied about how much the U.S. was actually involved. So there's even documents in there showing that the government tried to assassinate the leader of South Vietnam to help try to give Americans more power in the war, and really lied about how successful the U.S. mission was in Vietnam. So this came out when Nixon was president, and Americans believed that if Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson were misleading them, if they were all lying to them, if all these presidents were lying, that Nixon probably was too. So we're going to see next time the conclusion of the war. How does Nixon try to wind down the war? Because Nixon is going to try to de-escalate the war, de-intensify it, get the U.S. out of Vietnam while also trying to win it. But ultimately, Vietnam is going to prove to be a failure. We're not going to win that war. And we'll see that next time. I hope you learned something today. Make sure you realize that the Tet Offensive, that attack that showed Johnson and the government was lying, really spurred and moved the American public for all these other things to happen, like the anti-war movement, the amendments like the 26th Amendment, court cases like Tinker versus Des Moines. All that stuff has really, really happened because of the Tet Offensive, that turning point. Hope you learned something today, guys. Thanks.